gonna start the dang video, but okay. This may be in like parts. Hang on, let me way back. I'm back. That kinda helped though, I guess. I don't know if it helped. I don't know if it helped, but anyway. This may be in parts, so it's gonna be. I'm actually what if Anakin Skywalker became a bounty hunter. But I'll be doing this in the parts, so this is gonna be part 1. And again, channel will be in the description as always.
Hello! Our story begins on the barren wastelands of Tatooine. Inside of one of the major cities of the planet, there is a boy. One with a midichlorian count higher than that of any living being on record, or at least a record inside the Jedi archives on Coruscant. A rare chance of fate completely altered the life of the boy named Anakin Skywalker. Things he would never know about changed its destiny, and because of it, his life as a slave remained, at the foreseeable moment, permanently. Not far from his home world, the Queen of Naboo was able to break free from a blockade with no damage done to her personal star cruiser, allowing her easy passage to the core worlds. Anakin didn't know about any of this. The mundane life of a slave did not permit such luxuries. He never knew of anything going on outside of local politics thanks to Watto, pod racing, and his mother. Anakin was returning from yet another day slaving away at Watto's shop. He had a couple of extra parts that he could use to work on his pod racer. It was the only thing that gave him any semblance of hope. His dreams were becoming a professional pod racer. The thought filled his mind with happiness, and it often was the last thing on his mind before he went to sleep most nights. It was much different to some dreams he had, but becoming a Jedi would never happen. Kids like him, on this planet and planets like this, never got visits from the Jedi, let alone being welcomed into their orders so far away. He walked over to his small pod racer and opened up one of the engine thrusters and started toying around. A couple of his buddies from around the block asked him if he wanted to join them in some sort of game, but he politely declined. It may have been a little pretentious to act the way he was, but he knew as a slave he needed to build a future for himself. He had to secure it for himself because no one else was going to do it for him. With the Boonta Eve Classic coming up in a day or so, he needed his racer to be ready so that he could race in the event. A win at the Boonta Eve would put his name on the map. Perhaps he could be picked up by Jabba the Hutt or someone else with a big name in the game. For him, it was a huge deal. He knew that he wanted to be picked up by someone like Jabba because that would gift him luxuries he could only dream of. Anakin worked with dedication in his heart and focus in his eyes. It wasn't that just winning would get him the money, but it would get him the freedom. Despite Anakin's dislike for the crime families, due to them being slave owners themselves, he couldn't deny the truth. They had the power on the planet. Even if he disagreed with them, he still needed to play their game to get by. To get a sponsorship from Jabba would be life-altering, and they give a lot more than just freedom for himself and his mother. Of course, it wasn't quite freedom. It was more or less an indentured servitude. He would still have to work for the Hutts as a professional racer, but it was much better than being a worker inside Watto's little shop. Anakin worked for hours on his pod racer, breaking past the pain of blistered fingers and the heat of the twin suns beating down his back as he worked. His mother always hated the idea of him having a fascination with being a racer, but she never really believed it would get to a point where he could run with it. She just hoped he wouldn't hurt himself. It wasn't that she didn't encourage him or the dreams that he had for himself. It was more that she just didn't want him to get hurt. Pod racing was extremely dangerous, and most humans couldn't participate in it, let alone 9-year-old boys. When the sun set, Anakin finally went inside and spent time with his mother before it was time for him to go to bed. Anakin had to be ready for work tomorrow. The day after, he was going to participate in the Boonta Eve Classic, and he was going to win. He was excited, but an excited mind needed to be put to sleep, so he could be full of energy when the time was right. The morning came, and Anakin was up before the sun's even crested. His first order of business was 30 minutes or so to play around with C-3PO, his protocol droid. 3PO was a work in progress, but someday, he'd be a great asset to his mother and him. Anakin loved the thought of being able to free his mom from slavery, and then helping her with her life and anything else she wanted. Giving her 3PO was his long-term gift idea. While he was working on 3PO, he ran into the kitchen and grabbed a portion muffin, and then put it into a heating tray and watched it come to life, while he was shifting some parts around inside of 3PO's chest. It brought him joy to watch it come to life as he turned back and started working on the droid again. Every couple minutes he'd take a bite before finishing the muffin and sauntering off to work. As a slave, he had all the mundane tasks to do, and because of his servitude, he had to open up the shop and clean everything up before the first customer started to arrive. Anakin also had to move things around, like fronting smaller items inside the shop itself and cleaning up the walkways outside in the small courtyard. Watto didn't usually arrive until a couple hours after the sun rose, so Anakin had to attend to some of the first customers. It was a bit of a drag, but most of Watto's customers loved little Annie. He was kind, welcoming, and quite the bundle of joy to have around. Anakin helped them get whatever they needed and checked them out. When they weren't customers patrolling the shop, he was simply finding smaller tasks to pass the time, things he figured Watto would like him to do. By this point, he kind of already knew what Watto wanted, so he just did it before he got to the shop. It actually helped him a lot. While Anakin was a slave, Watto was pretty decent to him, as decent as anyone could be while owning another person, which isn't really saying much. But for Anakin, it was a big deal, mostly because Watto was really the closest thing he had to a father figure. And being that that was the case, he was super excited to tell Watto about his aspirations to compete in the Boonta Eve Classic tomorrow. Watto didn't like the idea of this, mostly because he didn't want his slave competing in a competition and damaging himself. He had high hopes for Skywalker. He'd be a great long-term investment, and if he got hurt during the race or died, it wouldn't be worth his investment, which would be a loss of profit for Watto. He only wanted to make money and save money, and having Anakin compete was a risk to both of those. The Tordarian didn't believe that Anakin would be a big man by any means, but he would force him to work until he was. He'd be great at selling material, and he could probably get a good bundle package for both Skywalkers once Anakin was 15, 16, or even 17. He told Anakin that he didn't think he should participate. Anakin was a little rebel anyways, and he was excited and expressive about the racer he built for himself. He didn't just want to waste that machine, so he told Watto that he would participate in the race, and that was where his heart was. The slaver just shrugged his shoulders and told Anakin to suit himself. Of course, it would never be that easy, so later that day, Anakin was given time to get off early so he could go and play with his pod racer and have himself ready for the race. Watto wasn't going to just stand for anything like this, so he let Anakin believe he had himself a chance at racing, only for that to slip away from him when he least expected it. This was mostly due to Watto believing that a 9-year-old boy wouldn't notice if something went awry with his pod racer. Again, being that Watto didn't want to damage his property, he sent a group of smugglers to Anakin's racer to steal some parts. This happened in the late evening when Anakin had already gone to sleep. It was just another day of working on the racer, so for Anakin, nothing was all different. When he woke up in the morning, he still didn't notice anything as a couple EOPs transported the pod racer to the hangar bay before the race. This was the racer's last chance to fix any issues their vehicles might have. If they didn't believe there was anything wrong, then there should be no issue with getting to the starting line and beginning their race. Anakin didn't notice anything until he got to the garage. Then he noticed a slew of issues. He began looking around his racer. There were a couple things missing. They weren't obvious things either, but being that he put the racer together himself, it was very clear to him what was missing. There were a couple plugs on the left thruster, a couple cables missing in the center console, and his visor was taking off his helmet, which was just really weird. And then in the right thruster, there were a couple things that were missing but just placed in different locations. Anakin quickly got to work as his mother tried to suggest that maybe it was best to not participate in today's race. But Anakin had already put the pressure on himself that if he didn't win, his mother would continue to suffer. Shmi, of course, had no clue about any of this and believed that Anakin was having delusions of grandeur. She didn't want him to get hurt, and she tried to dissuade him, but Anakin knew his pod racer. He knew what was wrong with it, and he could fix it. It wouldn't take too much time. He just needed to do it quickly. He attached some spare cables he had in his toolbox. He was lent a pair of goggles for his helmet and was also able to borrow a couple plugs from another racer. It wasn't that big of a deal. The only issue was rearranging done to the one thruster. He quickly worked through it, and then the hangar's alarm sounded. It was time for all the racers to make their way to the starting line to prepare for the race. Anakin scrambled as quickly as he could and looked at his work. Everything seemed right. He had a small cheat sheet that he collected together over his time of manufacturing his racer. The cheat sheet was something to just keep around while he's working on it, so he knew what each combination did. If a certain cable and plug were together, then the ignition would start. If another wire was misplaced elsewhere, it would stall the engine out. Nothing too serious if it didn't work, which it would work, so no need to worry. Obviously, Anakin had a lot to worry about. This was a race for his mother and his freedom. A couple of friends showed up, but not for nothing. He was disappointed that most of them didn't come. It wasn't a terribly big deal, he was just hoping that someone else might show up to support him. Those who were here with him would come with him to the top. When he thrived, those buddies would thrive with him. Real simple. Everything was perfect. The racer was on the track and everything looked to be ready to go. Every racer's flag was paraded in front of the starting line before they were given the signal. A couple of the racers, most specifically Saboba, bantered with Skywalker, but it wasn't anything Anakin wasn't used to. He handled it expertly and prepared for his first real challenge. As the racers started their engines, Jabba rang the bell and a quick 3, 2, 1 passed by as the race started. Anakin wasn't the only one, but his racer stalled out. He quickly got onto the controls and tried to figure out what was going on. He flicked the switches and pulled the levers, trying to re-engage the thrusters. He felt so embarrassed, but this wasn't the worst of it. He kept messing with the thruster controls, and one of them ignited but slipped off, flying through the air and slamming down in the middle of the track into a massive explosion. Anakin saw a red blinking on his console and panicked as he jumped out of the racer and ran as fast as he could. The racer he spent so much time building and making perfect in the hopes that it would free him from slavery exploded behind him. He was launched forward and crashed into a concession stand nearby. Anakin looked back over the fires burning in the middle of the track. His heart sank into his chest. He couldn't believe it. He looked around the raceway to see people all murmuring. Up in the announcer's booth, there were jokes being made at Anakin's expense. He looked around and saw his friends on the other side of the track with horrified expressions on their faces. Anakin turned away and walked as fast as he could from the raceway. Shmi was in the stands as she quickly made her way down towards Anakin, but by the time she got down there, he was already gone. She looked around but couldn't find him. Anakin's friends came over and pointed her in the direction he went down. When Shmi ran out of the racing arena, she couldn't find her boy. He just vanished like a ghost into the crowd. She knew he would come back at some point, but that didn't matter. She was determined to find her boy. She ran out into the seas of people moving around on Boonta Eve Day. It was such a big celebration on Tatooine, especially in Mos Espa, so the streets were crowded, though it was easy to find Anakin, in a way. There were crowds of people splitting up as he ran through. Everyone just watched his racer explode on their screens. Seeing him run past them elicited a couple emotions. Macho individuals just laughed at him because he wasn't able to control his pod racer, and that's what he got for trying. Regular people felt either pity, shame, or genuinely sad for him. Others just kind of avoided the entire thing. He was a 9-year-old running through the streets completely embarrassed, and his mother eventually caught up to him to tell him that it would be alright. He obviously was an emotional wreck, and she comforted him, hugging him and telling him that everything would be okay. He was just so frustrated, and when they broke off their hug, he walked around in a circle, pacing around. They were away from the crowds by this point, so there was plenty of room for him to move around like this. She told Anakin that failure was a natural part of life, and he threw his hands down and expressed that this wasn't failure. It was an utter embarrassment, and even worse than that, he lost his pod racer. How would he race now? He couldn't salvage anything. The entire thing was destroyed in the process. His frustration and anger broke apart as tears started to fall from his eyes, and he told his mom that it was unfair. He was supposed to be the racer to free them from slavery. Now they were stuck. She realized now what racing meant to him. The whole point of winning wasn't for the money or the accolades or anything. It was for their freedom. Shmi told Anakin that that was never his burden to bear. It was unfair, sure, but it wasn't his fault. She always wanted to get him out of it, but there was never really any easy way around it. They didn't make money, so she couldn't buy their way out of it. It was just bad luck of the draw. But the main point is that she didn't want him to feel responsible for it. She would help get him out of it, maybe not now, but at some point, and that was a promise. Anakin thanked her, but he also apologized. Shmi just smiled and took his hand, walking with them back to their home. Anakin would have nightmares for the coming nights, going into weeks. Losing his pod racer was a crushing thing to his morale. He needed something to focus on, and while 3PO was getting more work than ever in the past few weeks, it just wasn't the same. The pod racer was his dream. Being a racer was all he wanted, and now that was stripped away from him. He had to find a new dream and evolve. Because just like every other kid on Tatooine who wanted to be a pod racer, they'd have to choose the path that better suited them. Or did they? Anakin kept up a positive outlook, regardless of how difficult it was for him. They still got their weekly portions, and despite some teasing from Watto, not much had changed in his life. Anakin just put more effort into 3PO. The protocol droid was coming along rather quickly, which was a great relief. There were a couple pieces being put onto his armor and so forth. As the hopeless days went by, Anakin's friend group started to detach themselves from him, which made everything worse. He didn't want it to happen, but he just didn't go out and play much anymore, so everyone collectively just moved on without him, having their fun and forgetting that he ever existed. It's not that Anakin wasn't outside anymore, it was more or less he wasn't always outside, because 3PO was always inside. Though during a walk back from Watto's shop, he was stopped by a member of a local crew. Anakin looked over and realized it was the leader of the crew. Mos Espa and Tatooine had a bunch of these little crews or gangs. They all worked for Jabba, but they were allowed to police around under the authority of the daimyo. Anakin recognized the crew boss. His name was Jalem Littil.
Hey boy, aren't you the kid whose racer exploded during the Boonta Eve?
Hi, Jalem. What do you want?
Nothing. How are you holding up after losing your racer?
Look, Jay, I don't have time for this. I'm tired of being made a joke of.
What do you mean? I'm just asking.
Clearly you're not. You're trying to get a rise out of me, and it won't work.
Who's picking on you? I'll have my boys teach him a lesson. No need to be hostile. We're pretty much the same.
We are nothing alike, Jalem.
Yeah, we are. I lost my treasured item when I was a youngin' too. I just didn't have someone who had my back.
What are you trying to get at?
You got a spark. Just trying to see if you wanted my crew. It's a way out of the system. You may be a slave for a little bit, but at least there'll be an attainable future for you.
Jalen, I don't want to kill anyone. The thought of taking someone's life just freaks me out.
You ain't gotta kill anyone. Just join the crew. You'll get protection from Jabba.
What about the gang fights?
What about them? We stop them. We're not instigators. We deflate situations.
How about this? I'll think about it.
Sounds good, kid. I'll see you around.
Anakin walked away. He was surprised Jalen recognized him after so long. He didn't really understand why he'd be asking 10-year-olds to join his crew, but there was a reason. Jalen had been recruiting a lot of kids into the crew. He needed depth for the future of the group. If he didn't build it up now, he would lose it all in the future. Politics on Tatooine were always really rugged, and so, being that the gang fights could happen, and even crew fights happened, there was always a lot of death. People were constantly being killed, and it was Jalen's job as a crew boss to hire people into the crew. Plus, the reason he thought that Skywalker would be a good candidate was because of his quick reaction skill during the pod race. While millions of people saw a scared little boy, few on the planet, like Jalen, saw someone with quick reaction time. Whether or not it was a reaction to seeing a light indicator beeping, it was still a fast reaction, which is something that should be prided. If Anakin could move quickly, then he's someone who would make a good grunt or even a leader. Not quite a crew boss, but they'd have to see. Usually, the following weeks after the Boonta Eve were hectic. Gangs would start fights over a number of reasons. The two leading reasons being either gang won a ton of money or bets, and the other one to steal it from them, or a gang bet too much of something and they didn't have the money to pay it up, so others came to collect the credits. It was a time for cleaning out bad gangs in the area. Of course, Jabba allowed it. Competition was good for business. There were always fights between crews and gangs, and he didn't really care. They were all fighting for him, or claiming to be fighting for him, when in reality they were trying to grab a manufactured power gap that just simply didn't exist. It was Jabba's way to make the little guy feel big. They would get stuck in the ride of the rat race, always fighting, clawing and bickering their way to the top of the system that would never feed them the way it fed him. Jabba's influence was generational, and once all the first generation people died out, there was no one really to look at the system he created and think of it as unfair. It just became socially accepted, and the people lived in a constant state of fear. Slavery and piracy ran large, and no one could come to save them. The only way out was up, even if it meant just shoving the person next to them under, just so they could get a taste of the pot of credits that didn't really exist. Jabba's rule was firm, and because the crews and gangs constantly feuded with each other, he just thrived off of it. That didn't even go to the extensive power he had by bringing outside supplies into the planet like weapons, spice, and an assortment of other people pleasures. Just things to keep the mind occupied while the body destroyed itself in service to the hot cartel. People like Jalen were victims, and they passed their victimhood, without even realizing it, down onto the kids of their neighborhoods. Not for nothing, aside from the survival of Anakin, Jalen didn't really see real potential in Anakin. He just had this presence. He carried himself with respect, and someone like that would be great in the crew. If he didn't want to be a fighter, he could be a mechanic, but no harm in teaching him how to spin a blaster and fire it, right? Anakin returned home and continued working on his droid. 3PO was coming along nicely, and Anakin began putting pieces together onto his body, just covering up the naked circuits as a means to make the droid feel a little bit more comfortable. He found such joy in doing this, and despite not having his racer around anymore, or a whole lot of friends, Anakin was able to find happiness within himself. It wasn't something that always came easy. With Shmi by his side, he was able to get the comfort and the change of mindset he needed. Anakin's birthday came and went, and as a 10-year-old he decided that it was time to take Jalen up on his offer. He went back to the crew house one evening when he got done early, and he was welcomed in with open arms. Jalen was excited to have Skywalker show up on the front step of their little cantina. They called it a crew house because it was their little zone. No other crews were allowed to enter, and people who paid tribute to the crew had special access. Essentially, it was a cantina that pandered to a particular group of people to get protection from the outside, though it didn't mean that they'd always have a target on their head from crews across the city. When Anakin walked in, the people of the crew house all cheered him on. This was entirely intentional. Jalen paid close attention to Anakin after the little encounter a couple weeks beforehand, and he noticed that Skywalker had little to no interaction with anyone else his age, so this hyping him up when he came in here was meant to pull him in closer by giving him some sort of that brotherly love he'd been missing. It was a good way to lower his guard and make him feel safe, and trap him with them. It was a nice manipulation tactic, but it worked so well. It was much easier to do with kids and down-on-their-luck individuals on Tatooine. Jalen yelled out and told everyone that there was a free round on the house in honor of the arrival of Anakin Skywalker. The bar let out a huge cheer as they turned towards Anakin, raising their drinks into the air. A couple people coming in from the back patted him on the shoulder as Jalen told Anakin to come with them. All the euphoria blinded his senses, and so he followed right along. There was a small shooting range out back, and Jalem asked Anakin if he ever shot before, and he just shook his head. So he asked Anakin if he would like to try, and he shrugged his shoulders. Jalem pulled his pistol from his belt. It was a K-16 Briar pistol. He spun it around in his hand before gently handing it over to Skywalker. He knelt down and pointed at the sights and everything else on the pistol. He was more or less just helping Anakin get a hang of this whole pistol thing. Once he was done explaining everything to him, he told him to unlock the safety whenever he was ready and pull the trigger. Anakin looked over at Jalem and then fired at the target. Anakin smacked the target with a perfect hit. Jalem jumped up and yelled out with excitement and told Anakin that that was beginner's luck. He pulled out a couple more bottles and lined them up across the front of the target. He told Anakin to hit those 3 bottles. Anakin smiled and raised his hand, pulled the trigger 3 times. All 3 bottles were hit. Only one of them was clipped, which wasn't that big of a deal. Technically, it was a hit. Jalem ran over to Anakin's side and told him that he was a great shot so far. Anakin jumped up with excitement, adrenaline running through his body. He told Jalem that he thought that it was fun, so Jalem told Anakin that if he wanted to come by after his work, he was always welcome. Jalem told Anakin to keep the pistol, and pulled a small patch from his pocket and slipped it into Anakin's hand. He told Skywalker that he was welcome to the crew anytime he wanted to join. While Anakin was familiar with the names of the crews and gangs in the area, apparently he wasn't. The group that Jalem was a part of was called Dragon's Breath. They got their name a couple generations back when the founder of the crew told stories of apparently killing a krayt dragon. He was renowned for saying the Dragon's Breath could choke a sand person. The name just came from his obsession of telling the story. Many people at a certain point refused to believe him, even though it actually was true. Those who did believe him decided to rally behind him, and then Dragon's Breath was formed. Ever since then, it had been a powerhouse in Mos Espa, though it always struggled, simply due to Jabba's fair play rules. There were caps on how large a crew could get, and how many crew locations they could have. Typically, the way the show's strength was through elite numbers, updated vehicles, and so on. It was very common for members of the crew to polish their vehicles like they were being stored inside of Coruscant garages. It was just another example of the poor trying to be like the rich. And in those particular cases, it was the collective poor on Tatooine against the people of the core. Anyway.
Alright.
Anyways, Jalem believed that he could convince Skywalker to join Dragon's Breath as a mechanic and then give him the idea to become one of their gunners, or whatnot. It was worth a shot.
Alright. I want to end this to be part 1. I'll end this here, and then part 2 I'll do either later tonight or sometime later, or might do part 2, I guess, tomorrow. But again, channel will be in the description as always. So bye for now, and then, yeah. This will be part 1. I'll be doing part 2 later today. Maybe part 2 later today or part 2 tomorrow. Either way, I'll be doing this in the part, so bye for now.